My perfect double life crumbled when both my husbands met me at my company gala. I had spent years weaving a flawless illusion, but that night, everything unraveled. How did I let it come to this? Could I salvage anything when the two worlds I built collided in the most spectacular fashion? The room buzzed with laughter, the tinkling of glasses, and the low hum of conversations. I stood near the grand entrance, pretending to fix a bracelet while my heart raced. The company gala was my proudest achievement, a crowning jewel of my professional life. But tonight, it felt like my undoing. I glanced at the man walking toward me, Jason, my suburban husband, his easy smile, his kind eyes, the man who adored me for my warmth and stability. My heart clenched with guilt as he kissed my cheek. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his hand lingering on my waist. "Thank you," I replied, masking my nerves with a dazzling smile. But just as I started to relax, my breath hitched. Across the ballroom, entering through another door, was Henry, my downtown husband. His tailored suit, his sharp confidence, the man who loved my ambition and spark. My two lives were converging, and I was at the epicenter of an inevitable explosion. "Everything okay?" Jason asked, noticing my distraction. "Of course," I lied, brushing off his concern, "just overwhelmed by the turnout tonight." Jason followed my gaze across the room, but I deftly redirected him toward the buffet. Every second Henry drew closer felt like a countdown to disaster. My brain worked overtime, concocting excuses and contingency plans. How could I keep them apart? "Stay right here," I told Jason. "I need to check on the seating arrangements. Don't go anywhere, okay?" He nodded, oblivious to my turmoil. I weaved through the crowd, throwing polite smiles while dodging colleagues eager to chat. My pulse thundered as I neared Henry, who was already scanning the room with his sharp eyes. "Darling," Henry said, his voice smooth and commanding as he leaned in for a kiss. "Henry," I murmured, quickly angling my face to offer him my cheek instead. His brow furrowed slightly. "Something wrong?" "Not at all," I said too quickly, taking his arm and steering him away from the center of the room. "I just wasn't expecting you so early. You invited me. Why wouldn't I come early to support you?" "Because I didn't expect you to actually attend," I wanted to scream. I'd invited Henry out of obligation, confident he would decline, as he often did for social events. "I'm thrilled you're here," I said instead, forcing a bright smile. "There's someone I want you to meet." I was desperate to keep him moving, far away from Jason. As we approached a cluster of co-workers, Henry's hand tightened on mine, halting my frantic stride. "What's going on, Sophie?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," I insisted, my laugh brittle. "Just managing everything tonight." Henry gave me a searching look, but didn't press further. I left him with a group from marketing, hoping their relentless chatter would hold his attention. My reprieve was short-lived. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jason approaching, a plate of hors d'oeuvres in hand. Panic surged. "Jason," I called, intercepting him before he could get too close. He smiled warmly. "I thought you might be hungry." "That's so sweet, but I've already eaten," I said, placing a hand on his chest to stop him. "Could you do me a favor and find the event photographer? He's supposed to be capturing candidates, but I haven't seen him yet." Jason frowned, but his innate helpfulness won out. "Sure, I'll track him down." I exhaled a shaky breath as he turned away. But relief was fleeting. I couldn't keep them apart forever. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk, strategic diversions, and mounting dread. Every time Jason or Henry came near, I maneuvered them like chess pieces, ensuring their paths never crossed. But fate had other plans. It happened as the night wound down. Henry, bored with small talk, wandered toward the bar. Jason, eager to toast the event, headed there as well. I saw them before they saw each other. My stomach dropped. Jason turned, drink in hand, just as Henry extended his for a whiskey. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither seemed to process what they were seeing. Then Jason's gaze shifted, landing on me. "Sophie," he said, confusion etched on his face. Henry followed his line of sight, his brows knitting together as he took in the scene. "Sophie, what's going on?" Henry demanded, his voice sharp. My mouth went dry. Words failed me. The noise of the room faded into a deafening silence as both men stared at me, waiting for an explanation. "Jason, Henry, let's talk somewhere private," I managed to stammer, my voice trembling. But they weren't moving. Jason's face hardened as realization dawned. "Who is he?" he asked, his tone icy. Henry's expression darkened. "That's what I'd like to know." The world tilted and I knew there was no escape. The double life I had so carefully constructed was crumbling around me, exposed under the glaring lights of the gala. Both husbands stood before me, their questions piercing through the facade I had worked so hard to maintain, and I had no idea how to answer. I could barely feel my legs as I led Jason and Henry into one of the private conference rooms adjacent to the ballroom. The gala continued in full swing behind us, the laughter and music serving as a cruel juxtaposition to the tension suffocating the air. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every rational thought. How had it come to this? Jason's face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly as he gripped the back of a chair. Henry, on the other hand, stood rigidly by the door, his piercing eyes locked on me. They were both waiting for an explanation, and I was out of places to hide. "Sophie," Jason said, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. "What is going on here?" Henry crossed his arms, his voice low and menacing. "Yes, Sophie, I think we all deserve an answer." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My hands trembled as I fidgeted with the clasp of my bracelet, buying time I didn't have. How could I possibly explain this? How could I even begin to justify my actions? "Jason, Henry," I finally started, my voice cracking. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." Jason flinched as though I'd slapped him. "Find out what?" he demanded. "That you've been lying to me? To us?" Henry let out a bitter laugh, his usual composure slipping. "Lying? That's an understatement, don't you think? She's been leading a double life, Jason. Look at her. 2 husbands, 2 lives, and God knows how many other secrets." The words cut deeper than I'd expected. I had spent years convincing myself that I wasn't hurting anyone, that I could manage the balancing act indefinitely. But now, standing in the middle of the wreckage I'd created, I saw the folly of my choices. "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said, my voice barely audible. Jason's eyes filled with a mix of anger and hurt. "Didn't plan for what, Sophie? To marry me? To marry him? Or to get caught?" My throat tightened. I felt the weight of their stares pressing down on me, demanding answers I couldn't fully articulate. "I love you both," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I didn't mean for it to be this way, but it happened. Henry's expression darkened further. "Love? You call this love? Deceiving us both? Playing house in 2 separate lives? How dare you stand there and use that word?" Tears welled in my eyes as the full gravity of my betrayal hit me. "I didn't want to lose either of you," I whispered. "I thought I could make it work. You thought you could get away with it," Jason interjected, his voice icy. "That's what you thought." "I was careful," I said, desperation creeping into my tone. "I never meant to hurt either of you. I thought I was keeping things under control." Henry stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "Control? Sophie, do you hear yourself? This isn't control, it's chaos, it's manipulation." "I know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I know I was wrong, but I loved you, both of you in different ways. Jason, you gave me stability, a sense of home. And Henry, You made me feel alive, like I could conquer the world. I couldn't choose. I couldn't lose either of you. Jason's face crumpled, his anger giving way to visible heartbreak. Do you even hear yourself? You weren't just lying to us. You were lying to yourself. Henry looked at me with pure disgust. And you didn't think about the fallout? About what this would do to us if it all came crashing down? Or was that not part of your grand plan? The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Of course, I hadn't thought it through. I had been so consumed by my desire to maintain both relationships that I had ignored the inevitable consequences. I didn't want it to end like this, I murmured, tears spilling over. Jason laughed, bitterly shaking his head. How did you think it was going to end, Sophie? Did you think you'd juggle this forever? That you'd die of old age with two loving husbands by your side, blissfully unaware of each other? His words stung, but I had no rebuttal. He was right. I had been delusional, selfish, and reckless. Henry's voice dropped to a low growl. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to us? I hesitated, knowing the truth would only deepen the wounds, but there was no point in lying anymore. 3 years, I admitted. Jason flinched again, his hand gripping the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. 3 years, he repeated, his voice hollow. 3 years of my life wasted on a lie. Henry's face twisted with anger. 3 years! Do you have any idea what you've done, Sophie? You didn't just betray us, you destroyed us. Do you even feel the weight of that? The room fell into a heavy silence. The guilt and shame were suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice. I never wanted to hurt you, I said weakly, but even I could hear how empty the words sounded. Jason's shoulders sagged as he released a shaky breath. Well, congratulations, Sophie. You didn't just hurt us. You broke us. Henry scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. And now what? Do you expect us to forgive you? To let you off the hook because you didn't mean to? I don't expect anything, I said, my voice trembling. I just want you to understand. Understand? Jason snapped, his anger flaring again. Understand what, Sophie? That you're selfish? That you played us both for fools? What exactly are we supposed to understand? I had no answer. There was no justification for what I'd done, no explanation that could erase the pain I had caused. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words and shattered trust. Finally, Henry broke it. I can't do this, he said coldly, turning toward the door. I can't even look at you. Jason's gaze softened, but the pain in his eyes was unbearable. Neither can I, he said quietly. I thought you were my everything, Sophie. Turns out, I was just a piece of your puzzle. And with that, they both walked out, leaving me alone in the stark, empty conference room. The weight of my actions crashed down on me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. The night of the first betrayal was vivid in my memory, even now. It wasn't premeditated, at least that's what I told myself. It was a moment of weakness, a fracture in my marriage with Jason that I never repaired. But in truth, it was more than that. It was the start of something intoxicating, a whirlwind I couldn't bring myself to resist. Jason had been working late for weeks, consumed by his new promotion. I was proud of him, of the stability he provided, of the life we were building together. But I was lonely. The hours stretched endlessly in our quiet suburban home, where my only company was the hum of the dishwasher or the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. I tried to fill the void with projects, redecorating the guest room, joining a yoga class, even volunteering at a local shelter, but nothing replaced the warmth of Jason's presence or the sound of his laugh echoing through the house. I missed him in ways I didn't know how to articulate, and when I tried, he brushed me off with reassurances. It's just a busy season, he'd say, kissing me quickly on his way out the door. Things will slow down soon. But they didn't. That evening, the loneliness was particularly acute. Jason had called to say he'd be home late, again, and I found myself scrolling through my phone aimlessly. That's when I saw the notification, a networking event downtown, hosted by a consulting firm I'd worked with years ago. I wasn't planning to go, it wasn't my world anymore. But something about the idea of being surrounded by people, of escaping the quiet confines of our home, called to me. I slipped into a sleek black dress I hadn't worn in years, applied a swipe of red lipstick, and grabbed my clutch. The reflection in the mirror startled me. I hadn't looked this put together in months. It was as if I'd stepped into a version of myself I barely recognized, a woman who still turned heads and commanded attention. The venue was a rooftop bar, its glittering skyline view the perfect backdrop for a crowd of ambitious professionals. I felt a pang of nostalgia for the life I'd left behind when Jason and I moved to the suburbs. Back then, I was a rising star in my field, juggling projects and late-night dinners with clients. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. I wandered through the crowd, sipping champagne and nodding politely at strangers until I saw him. Henry. He was standing near the bar, deep in conversation with a small group. His suit was impeccably tailored, his presence magnetic. There was an air of confidence about him that drew people in, myself included. Our eyes met, and he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a thrill down my spine. "Can I get you another drink?" he asked, his voice low and smooth as I approached the bar. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Sure." He waved to the bartender, ordering another glass of champagne for me and a whiskey for himself. As he handed me the glass, his fingers brushed mine, and the contact lingered just a second too long. It was subtle, but enough to make my pulse quicken. "I'm Henry," he said, holding out his hand. "Sophie," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his gaze steady. We fell into easy conversation, trading stories about our careers and laughing over shared frustrations about the corporate world. I told him about the consulting projects I used to manage, and he told me about his work in finance. He was charming and attentive, asking questions that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in months. As the night wore on, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his looks or his confidence, it was the way he made me feel, like I mattered, like I wasn't just another piece of furniture in someone else's life. The first crack appeared when he leaned in closer, his cologne subtle but intoxicating, and said, "You're wasted in the suburbs. You belong in a city like this." I laughed, brushing off his comment. "It's not so bad. Quiet, predictable." "Quiet and predictable are overrated," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're not the type to fade into the background, Sophie." I felt a blush creeping up my neck, and I looked away, pretending to study the skyline. "You don't know me well enough to say that." "Don't I?" His voice was soft, teasing. The tension between us was palpable, an electric current that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just a conversation. But when he suggested we step out onto the terrace for some fresh air, I didn't hesitate. The city stretched out before us, a sea of lights and possibilities. The night air was cool against my skin, and I shivered slightly. Without a word, Henry slipped off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it felt intimate. "Better?" he asked, his voice close to my ear. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. My heart was racing, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't control. We stood there in silence for a moment, the noise of the party fading into the background. Then he turned to me, his expression serious. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about you. I can't explain it, but I haven't felt this way in a long time." My breath caught in my throat. "Henry, Before I could finish, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine. It was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, but when I didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, his hands gently cupping my face. For a moment, the world fell away. There was no Jason, no suburban life waiting for me, just the intoxicating warmth of Henry's touch and the heady rush of doing something I shouldn't. When we finally broke apart, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. I stepped back, shaking my head. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. Henry looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" "Because I'm married," I admitted, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Are you happy?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because the truth scared me. Instead, I turned and walked back inside, leaving Henry on the terrace. But as I navigated the crowded room, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, but deep down I knew it was more than that. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about Henry, his touch, his words, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. And when I crawled into bed next to Jason, his soft snores filling the room, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. But guilt wasn't enough to stop me. It was only the beginning. The days following that night were a blur of emotions. I told myself I'd put it behind me, that I'd focus on Jason and our life together. But Henry lingered in my mind, his voice playing on a loop, his touch haunting me like a ghost. The kiss had unlocked something dormant inside me, a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd buried under years of routines and quiet compromises. For a while, I avoided the temptation. I deleted the event photos from my phone to erase the memory of Henry's piercing gaze, and I threw myself into household projects and planning weekends with Jason. But even those moments felt hollow, as if I were simply going through the motions. Jason was too preoccupied with his career to notice the distance growing between us, which only deepened my loneliness. Then Henry texted me. It was just a single message. "I can't stop thinking about you." My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted it without a second thought. But instead I typed back, "Neither can I." That small admission opened the floodgates. From there it escalated quickly. Texts, phone calls, late-night exchanges where I bared my soul to a man who wasn't my husband. Henry listened in a way that Jason hadn't in years, his responses full of insight and validation. He made me feel seen, understood, desired. The next time I saw him, it was deliberate. He'd invited me to lunch under the guise of networking, something easy to justify if Jason asked. We met at a small Italian cafe downtown, tucked away from prying eyes. The moment I walked in and saw him waiting at the corner table, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, my resolve crumbled. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, standing as I approached. His smile was warm, disarming. "You look stunning." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks as I sat down, suddenly hyper-aware of the dress I'd chosen. Simple, yet flattering. "It's just lunch," I said, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding. "Just lunch," he agreed, though the way his eyes lingered on me said otherwise. The conversation flowed effortlessly, just as it had the first night we met. He asked about my ambitions, my hobbies, the things that made me happy. It was a stark contrast to Jason, whose conversations had grown increasingly practical. Grocery lists, schedules, house maintenance. As the lunch wound down, Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Can I see you again?" My pulse quickened. I should have said no. I should have walked out and never looked back. But instead, I nodded. "Maybe." He smiled. and I knew I was already lost. From then on, our meetings became more frequent, each one blurring the line between right and wrong until the line no longer existed. There was the gallery opening where he slipped his hand around my waist as we admired abstract paintings, the rooftop dinner where he pulled my chair closer to his so our knees touched under the table, and the night we went to a jazz bar, the dim lighting and sultry music creating a cocoon where the outside world ceased to exist. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I told Henry things I'd never told Jason, about my dreams of traveling the world, my frustrations with feeling like a supporting character in my own life. He listened intently, his responses thoughtful and affirming. "You're more than that, Sophie," he said one night, his hand brushing mine. "You're extraordinary." I believed him. I let myself believe him because it filled a void I hadn't even realized was there. But every moment with Henry came with a price. The lies I told Jason to cover my tracks piled up, each one more elaborate than the last. I fabricated work meetings, late yoga classes, weekend volunteer events, anything to buy myself time for this secret life I was building. The guilt was unbearable, but it wasn't enough to stop me. Every time I told myself it was the last time, Henry would pull me back in with a text, a call, a look that made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. The first time it became physical was at his apartment. He had invited me over for dinner, promising a quiet evening with no expectations. I told Jason I was going to a colleague's birthday party and kissed him goodbye, my stomach churning with nerves. Henry's apartment was sleek and modern, a reflection of his polished persona. The wine was already poured when I arrived, and soft jazz played in the background. We sat on his balcony, the city lights twinkling like stars, as we shared stories and laughed like old friends. But as the evening wore on, the distance between us narrowed. His hand brushed mine as he poured more wine, and his gaze lingered longer than it should. When I turned to comment on the view, he was already leaning in. The kiss was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly intimate. This time, I didn't pull away. My hands tangled in his hair as he pulled me closer, his warmth melting away every ounce of resistance I had left. We moved inside, the transition seamless, as though this was where we were always meant to end up. His hands were firm yet gentle, tracing lines on my skin that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just about desire, it was about being seen, being wanted. When it was over, we lay tangled together, the city lights casting shadows across the room. For a moment, I let myself forget the world outside, let myself believe that this could be enough. But the moment I stepped into my car to drive home, the weight of what I'd done crashed down on me. Jason was asleep when I got home, his soft snores filling the room as I slid into bed beside him. I stared at the ceiling, tears slipping silently down my cheeks as the enormity of my betrayal settled in. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment, but deep down I knew better. The pattern repeated itself. Each time I promised it would be the last. Each time I told myself I could walk away. But Henry became a part of my life, a secret compartment that I couldn't let go of. He brought color to my gray days, excitement to my monotonous routines. And yet, the duplicity gnawed at me. Every time Jason kissed me goodbye or told me he loved me, a part of me ached with shame. I wondered if he could sense the change, if he noticed the way I flinched when he touched me, the way I avoided his gaze when he asked about my day. But if Jason suspected anything, he never said. He was too busy with work, too wrapped up in his own world to notice the cracks in mine. And so I continued to live my double life, juggling two worlds that couldn't coexist. It was thrilling and devastating all at once, a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. What I didn't realize was that the knife would eventually cut through everything I had built, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. The company Gala was supposed to be the crowning jewel of my career. Months of planning had gone into the event, every detail meticulously curated to impress clients and colleagues alike. But as I stood in the ballroom, the glittering lights reflecting off crystal chandeliers, all I could think about was the storm brewing just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed life. Jason was already by my side, his arm resting lightly around my waist as he introduced himself to my colleagues. He looked every bit the devoted husband, his warm smile and easy charm a stark reminder of everything I was about to destroy. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from Henry. "Just arrived. Where are you?" My stomach clenched as I glanced at Jason. "I'll be right back," I said, forcing a smile. "I need to check on the catering." He nodded, oblivious to my rising panic. "Take your time. I'll be here." I slipped away, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I made my way to the entrance. Henry was there, standing tall in a tailored suit that only enhanced his commanding presence. He scanned the crowd, his eyes lighting up when they landed on me. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and smooth as he leaned in for a kiss. I turned my face at the last second, offering my cheek instead. "Henry," I said, my voice trembling. "You made it." "Of course I did," he replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You invited me." I forced another smile, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm glad you're here. Let me show you around." As I led him deeper into the room, my mind raced with ways to keep him away from Jason. Every second felt like walking a tightrope, the tension unbearable. But Henry was sharp, and it didn't take long for him to sense something was amiss. "You're nervous," he said as we reached the bar. "Just busy," I replied quickly. "A lot to manage tonight." Henry tilted his head, studying me. "Busy or hiding something?" Before I could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Sophie." I froze, my blood turning to ice, as I turned to see Jason walking toward us, a drink in hand. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jason's smile faltered as his eyes moved from me to Henry, then back again. Henry straightened, his expression hardening as realization began to dawn. "Jason," I stammered, stepping between them. "This is—" "Henry," he interrupted, extending a hand. "A friend of Sophie's, I assume?" Jason hesitated, his confusion giving way to suspicion. "Jason," he said, shaking Henry's hand. "Her husband." The words hung in the air like a grenade, and I could almost feel the pin being pulled. Henry's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he turned to me. "A husband," he repeated, his voice cold. "Interesting. I was under the impression you weren't married, Sophie." Jason's head snapped toward me, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "What is he talking about?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My carefully constructed world was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "Jason," I began, my voice shaking. "I can explain." "Explain?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me? To both of us?" Henry stepped closer, his anger barely contained. 3 years, Sophie. 3 years of my life. And you never thought to mention this? The room seemed to tilt as their voices overlapped, accusations flying faster than I could respond. My colleagues began to notice, their curious glances turning into open stares as the scene unfolded. "Let's take this somewhere private," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Please." But neither of them moved. Jason's face was a mixture of fury and heartbreak, while Henry's gaze was icy and unforgiving. "You made me believe you loved me," Jason said, his voice trembling. "You made me think we had something real." "I did love you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I love both of you." "Love," Henry spat. "Don't insult me, Sophie. This isn't love, it's manipulation." The murmurs around us grew louder, and I realized the entire room was watching. My career, my reputation, everything I had worked for was unraveling in real time. "I didn't want it to be like this," I said desperately. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "But you did," Jason said, his voice low and filled with pain. "You didn't just hurt us, you destroyed us." Henry let out a bitter laugh. "Destroyed us? Speak for yourself, Jason. I'm not the one who fell for her lies." Jason turned to him, his fists clenched. "You think you're better than me? You're just as much of a fool as I am." The tension between them was palpable, and I feared it would escalate into violence. I stepped between them, holding up my hands. "Stop," I said, my voice firm despite my tears. "Please, just stop." For a moment, they both stared at me, their anger momentarily eclipsed by disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I know I've hurt you, both of you, but I never meant for it to get this far. I thought I could handle it, that I could keep everything together." Henry shook his head, his expression a mixture of anger and pity. "You can't even take responsibility, can you? You were never in control, Sophie. You were just selfish." The words cut deep, but I knew they were true. Jason let out a shaky breath, stepping back. "I can't do this," he said quietly. "I can't even look at you right now." Henry glanced at him, then back at me. "Neither can I." And just like that, they both walked away, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the ballroom. The weight of their words, of my choices, pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. Around me, the gala continued, but I felt like I was standing in the eye of a hurricane. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built, was gone. I had destroyed the lives of two men I claimed to love, and in the process, I had destroyed myself. The silence of the house was deafening as I sat alone in the living room, nursing a cold cup of tea. The remnants of the gala echoed in my mind. Jason's devastated face, Henry's cold disdain, the judgmental whispers from colleagues as I left. My phone had been buzzing with messages from coworkers, but I couldn't bring myself to read them. I already knew what they would say. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me from my thoughts. "Jason." I stood, my body trembling, and waited as the front door opened. He stepped inside, his expression grim, and the air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't. Instead, he remained standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "How long?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "How long have you been lying to me?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Jason?" "Answer the question," he snapped, his voice rising. "How long?" 3 years, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air, and Jason's face twisted in a mixture of shock and anger. 3 years, he repeated, his voice hollow. 3 years of my life wasted on someone who didn't even have the decency to be honest. "It wasn't like that," I said desperately. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Jason. Didn't mean to hurt me," he said, his voice incredulous. "You married me, Sophie. You built a life with me. You made me believe we were a team, a family. And all that time you were with him too? How could you do this?" Oh, tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain, though I knew my words would fall short. "I loved you, Jason. I still do. But what?" he interrupted, his voice breaking. "You loved him too? Is that what you're going to say, that you thought you could love us both? Do you even hear how twisted that sounds?" I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't know how to choose," I admitted. "You gave me stability, Jason, a home, and Henry made me feel alive in ways I hadn't felt in years. I was selfish." I know that now. Jason let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room. Selfish? That doesn't even begin to cover it, Sophie. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself. You turned our marriage into a joke. Before I could respond, there was another knock at the door. My heart sank. I didn't need to open it to know who it was. Jason's eyes narrowed as he turned toward the sound. "Who's that?" he asked sharply. "Jason, please," I said, stepping in front of him. "Let me handle this." But he brushed past me, yanking the door open to reveal Henry standing on the porch. His expression was no less severe than Jason's. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jason demanded, his voice laced with venom. "I could ask you the same thing," Henry shot back, stepping inside without an invitation. "But we both know why we're here." "This is my house," Jason said, his fists clenching. "You don't get to walk in here like you belong." "Stop it," I said, stepping between them. "Both of you, just stop. This isn't going to solve anything." Jason turned to me, his eyes blazing. "You invited him here, didn't you?" "No," I said quickly. "I didn't. He must have—" "I came because we need to finish this conversation," Henry interjected, his gaze fixed on me. "All three of us." Jason let out a harsh laugh. "You think there's anything left to say? She's been lying to us both for years. What more do you need to hear?" "I need to understand why," Henry said, his voice cold. "Why, Sophie? Why did you string us along like this? Was it some kind of game to you?" "No," I said, my voice cracking. "It was never a game. I never wanted to hurt either of you." "But you did," Jason said, his voice shaking. "You hurt us both. And for what? So you could feel wanted, needed. What the hell were you looking for, Sophie?" I buried my face in my hands, the weight of their accusations crushing me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know why I did it. I was lonely. I was scared. I didn't know how to let go of either of you." Henry stepped closer, his voice laced with bitterness. "So instead, you kept us both, knowing full well what would happen if the truth came out. You didn't care about us, Sophie. You cared about yourself." "That's not true," I said, looking up at him. "I cared about both of you. I loved both of you." Jason shook his head, his voice filled with disbelief. "You don't even know what love is, Sophie. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." The room fell silent, the weight of their words settling over me like a suffocating blanket. I had no defense, no excuses left to offer. All I could do was stand there, drowning in the wreckage of my own making. Finally, Jason let out a shaky breath. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I can't do this anymore." "Jason, wait," I said, reaching for him. "Please." But he stepped back, his eyes filled with sorrow. "No, Sophie, you don't get to beg for forgiveness and expect everything to go back to normal. You destroyed us. There's no coming back from this." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I turned to Henry, my tears blurring my vision. "Henry." "Don't," he said sharply, cutting me off. "Don't even try to explain. Jason's right. There's nothing left to say." He started to leave, but paused at the door, turning back to look at me one last time. "You had everything, Sophie, and now you have nothing." With that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the empty house. The weight of their absence hit me like a tidal wave, and I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I had always feared this moment, the unraveling of my double life. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of losing them both. I had gambled with the lives of two men I claimed to love, and in the end I had lost everything. The days that followed were a haze of grief and self-loathing. I had lost both Jason and Henry, and with them the two worlds I had built so meticulously. The silence in the house was unbearable, every corner a reminder of the life I had destroyed. The scent of Jason's cologne still lingered on his side of the bed, and his coffee mug sat on the counter, untouched, since the morning of the gala. I wanted to call him, to beg him to come home, but I knew it would only make things worse. He had made it clear there was no coming back from this. As for Henry, I hadn't heard a word since he walked out that night. Part of me wanted to reach out to him too, but I couldn't bear the thought of his voice dripping with the same contempt I'd seen in his eyes. Instead, I sat in the wreckage of my own making, trying to piece together how I had fallen so far. The first tangible consequence came at work. The morning after the gala, I walked into the office to find an unnatural hush among my colleagues. Whispers trailed me as I made my way to my desk, their glances sharp and judgmental. By noon, it was clear that the story of my double life had spread like wildfire. The gala had been the perfect breeding ground for gossip, and my private life was now everyone's favorite topic. My boss called me into his office that afternoon. He was kind but firm, explaining that the public fallout from the scandal was damaging the company's reputation. "You're talented, Sophie," he said, his tone heavy with regret, "but we can't afford this kind of attention. I have no choice but to let you go." I nodded numbly, too drained to argue. I packed up my desk in silence, the weight of my colleagues' stares pressing down on me. The job I had worked so hard to build, the career I had sacrificed so much for, was gone. With nothing to fill my days, I was left alone with my thoughts. At first, I tried to distract myself, cleaning the house, binge-watching TV, even reorganizing the pantry, but the emptiness always crept back in, seeping into every corner of my life. Eventually, I realized I couldn't outrun the pain. I needed to face it, to understand why I had made the choices I did. I started therapy, desperate for answers. My therapist, Dr. Harper, was a calm, grounding presence, and in our sessions, she helped me untangle the web of emotions that had led me to this point. "It sounds like you were searching for something," she said one afternoon, her voice gentle. "Something you weren't getting from your relationships." I nodded, tears pooling in my eyes. Jason gave me stability, but it felt stagnant. And Henry made me feel alive, but it was all-consuming. I thought I could balance them, that I could have it all. Dr. Harper leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think you were afraid of choosing one life, of committing to one path and letting go of the other?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent so much time juggling two worlds that I had never stopped to ask myself what I truly wanted. In trying to hold on to everything, I had lost it all. The weeks turned into months, and slowly I began to rebuild. I took a part-time job at a local bookstore, far from the high-powered career I once had, but the quiet, predictable routine was exactly what I needed. I found solace in the rhythm of stacking shelves and chatting with customers, a stark contrast to the chaos that had defined my life for so long. I also reconnected with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my years of deception. At first I was hesitant, afraid of their judgment, but to my surprise, they welcomed me back with open arms, their forgiveness a balm to my wounded soul. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Jason. My heart raced as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. Subject: closure. "Sophie, I've spent months trying to make sense of what happened, trying to understand how the woman I loved could do something so devastating. I still don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But I've realized that holding on to the anger and pain is only hurting me. I don't know if I can forgive you, at least not yet, but I hope you find a way to forgive yourself. We both deserve peace, even if we can't find it together. Take care, Jason." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. They weren't an absolution, but they were a step, a sliver of hope that healing was possible, even if our paths had diverged. Not long after, I ran into Henry at a cafe downtown. It was the first time I'd seen him since that fateful night, and my stomach churned as I approached his table. "Henry," I said softly, my voice trembling. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Sophie, can I sit?" I asked, motioning to the empty chair. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead." The silence between us was heavy, but I forced myself to speak. "I'm sorry, Henry, for everything. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sophie. What you did, it broke something in me." "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But," he continued, his tone softening, "I can't carry this anger forever. It's exhausting. I need to let it go, for my own sake." I nodded, my chest tight with emotion. "I hope you find happiness, Henry. You deserve it." "Oh, do you?" he said, though his words lacked conviction. We parted ways after that, the conversation bittersweet. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was enough to help me move forward. As the months passed, I began to find a sense of peace. My life was simpler now, quieter, but it felt more authentic. I had stopped chasing the impossible, stopped trying to be everything to everyone. For the first time in years, I was learning to be enough for myself. The scars of my choices would always remain, a reminder of the pain I had caused and endured, but they were also a testament to my growth, to the lessons I had learned the hard way. And though I didn't know what the future held, I was finally ready to face it, with honesty, with courage, and with the hope that I could one day rebuild the trust I had so carelessly shattered. It's strange how life can change so drastically and yet still go on. The sun still rises, the world keeps turning, and people continue their routines, oblivious to the chaos unraveling in someone else's life. For months, I felt like I was standing still while the world moved around me, frozen in the wreckage of my own choices. But in that stillness, I began to see things more clearly than I ever had before. I often found myself replaying the events of the past few years, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything began to unravel. Was it the first time Jason stayed late at the office and I felt that pang of loneliness? Or was it the night I met Henry, drawn to him like a moth to a flame? Perhaps it was even earlier, in the quiet discontent that had settled into my heart without my realizing it. The truth was, there wasn't one moment, there wasn't one decision that led to the collapse of my life. It was a series of small choices, each one seemingly insignificant, that built upon each other until they formed an avalanche I couldn't stop. At first, I justified everything. I told myself I was filling the gaps in my marriage, that I deserved to feel wanted, alive, and whole. I convinced myself that I wasn't really hurting anyone as long as I kept my two worlds separate. But deep down, I knew the truth. The lies I told Jason, the secrets I kept from Henry, they were cracks in the foundation, and no matter how carefully I tried to patch them, the structure was doomed to collapse. Looking back, I realize now that I wasn't just betraying Jason and Henry, I was betraying myself. I had spent so much time trying to be everything for everyone that I lost sight of who I really was. I wanted Jason's stability, Henry's excitement, and the illusion of a perfect life, but I never stopped to ask myself what I truly needed. I was chasing something that didn't exist, and in the process I destroyed the things that did. One of the hardest lessons I've had to learn is that love isn't enough. Love isn't just about passion or excitement or even stability. It's about honesty, trust, and sacrifice. And I had failed on all three counts. I wanted to hold on to Jason and Henry because I loved parts of them, but I wasn't willing to make the sacrifices that true love requires. Instead, I chose the selfish path, trying to have it all while giving neither of them the respect they deserved. I also learned that loneliness isn't something another person can fix. I thought Jason's long hours and emotional distance were the cause of my unhappiness, and I turned to Henry to fill that void. But the loneliness was inside me, a product of my own inability to face my fears and insecurities. I used Jason and Henry as distractions, as band-aids for wounds I should have been healing on my own. Therapy helped me see these things, but the realizations didn't come easily. There were days when I wanted to walk away from the process, when the weight of my mistakes felt too heavy to bear. But Dr. Harper pushed me to stay, to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding for years. "Sophie," she said one afternoon, her voice calm but firm, "you keep talking about what you lost, your marriage, your relationships, your career. But what have you gained? What have you learned from all of this?" Her question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. It took me days to answer her, and even then the response was tentative, fragile. "I've learned that I can't keep running from myself," I told her. "I've learned that I have to take responsibility for my actions, even when it's painful. And I've learned that I need to figure out who I am, not who I think I'm supposed to be." She smiled gently, nodding. "That's a good start." As time went on, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. It wasn't easy. I still had moments of deep regret, nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd ever find peace. But slowly, I began to forgive myself. Not completely, not yet, but enough to take the next step forward. I spent more time with myself, learning to be comfortable in my own company. I went on long walks in the park, sat in cafes with a good book, and even tried painting, a hobby I hadn't touched since college. These small acts of self-care helped me reconnect with the person I had been before my life became so complicated. I also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, hoping to use my experience as a cautionary tale for others. It wasn't about seeking redemption. It was about finding a way to turn my pain into something meaningful. The women I met there, each with their own stories of resilience and strength, inspired me to keep going, to keep growing. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was something close. A quiet acceptance of where I was and how far I had come. The ache of losing Jason and Henry was still there, but it no longer defined me. It was part of my story, but it wasn't the whole story. I thought about Jason's email, the way he had wished me peace even in his pain. And I thought about Henry, the way he had looked at me that day in the cafe, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. They were both right. I couldn't undo the past, but I could learn from it. I could choose to be better, to live with honesty and integrity, even if it meant starting over from scratch. In the end, I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't the one I had inflicted on Jason or Henry. It was the one I had inflicted on myself. I had betrayed my own values, my own sense of who I was, in pursuit of an impossible ideal. But now, for the first time in years, I was beginning to find my way back to myself. The reflection wasn't perfect, and neither was I. There were still days when the weight of my mistakes felt unbearable, when I questioned whether I deserved the second chance I was trying to give myself. But those days were becoming fewer and farther between, replaced by moments of quiet strength and resilience. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I would face it with honesty, with courage, and with a newfound understanding of who I was and who I wanted to be. Because sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the past and trust that the pieces will fall into place. And for the first time, I was ready to do just that. The first time I truly felt hope again. came in the most unexpected way. Quiet Sunday morning as I walked through the farmer's market downtown. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly baked bread and blooming flowers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt light, not happy, not quite yet, but no longer weighed down by the constant ache of regret. I stopped at a stall selling handmade candles, their soft glow and subtle fragrances drawing me in. As I reached for a lavender-scented one, my hand brushed against someone else's. I looked up, startled, and there he was. Jason. For a moment, neither of us spoke. His expression was unreadable, his eyes flicking to the candle I still held before settling back on me. He looked good, better than I expected. There was a calmness about him, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "Jean-Fille," he said, his voice steady but guarded. "Jason," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "Huh?" He glanced down at the candle in my hand, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Lavender. Still your favorite?" I nodded, the simple observation stirring something deep inside me. "Yes, it always has been." There was a pause, heavy with the weight of all the things we hadn't said to each other. Finally, he cleared his throat. "How have you been?" The question was so ordinary, so polite, yet it carried so much weight. "Better," I said honestly. "Trying to rebuild, taking things one day at a time." He nodded, his gaze softening just a fraction. "That's good. You look different, calmer." I smiled faintly. "Therapy will do that, I guess. It's been enlightening." "I'm glad," he said, and I could tell he meant it. There was another pause, and then he said, "I got your letter." I blinked, surprised. I had written to him months ago, a long, heartfelt apology that I never expected him to respond to. "I wasn't sure if you'd read it," I admitted. "I did," he said. "It took me a while, but I read it, and I appreciated it. I can't say it changed how I feel about what happened, but it helped me understand. A little." "That's all I wanted," I said softly. "I didn't write it to ask for forgiveness. I wrote it because you deserved the truth." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It made me realize I wasn't blameless either. I was so focused on work, on providing, that I didn't see how much we were drifting apart. I didn't see how lonely you were." I swallowed hard, his words catching me off guard. "Jason, you weren't responsible for what I did. That was my choice. My mistake." "Maybe," he said, "but relationships don't break in a vacuum. There were cracks long before everything." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded. He was right, of course. We had both contributed to the distance between us, though in vastly different ways. We talked for a little while longer, the conversation surprisingly easy despite the tension that still lingered. I told him about my new job at the bookstore and the volunteering I'd started. He told me about a hiking group he'd joined and how he was considering a career change. As we spoke, I felt a sense of closure beginning to form, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that allows you to move forward without its weight pressing down on you. For the first time, I felt like we were two people who had shared something important, even if it hadn't lasted. When we finally parted ways, Jason offered me a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Sophie." "You too," I said, my voice steady. "And thank you for talking to me." He nodded, and then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him leave, a strange mix of sadness and relief settling over me. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something close, and that was enough. Not long after, I received an unexpected email from Henry. It was short, almost curt, but it carried a surprising message. Subject: moving on. "Sophie, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I wanted to let you know that I'm working on letting go of the anger. It's not easy, but it's necessary. For what it's worth, I hope you find peace too. Take care. Henry. I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions swirling. Like Jason, Henry wasn't offering forgiveness, but he was offering me something equally valuable, the chance to let go, to stop carrying the burden of his pain along with my own. I replied with a simple message of thanks, not expecting anything more, and that was the last I heard from him. Life continued, slow and steady. The bookstore became a sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the comfort of routine and the endless possibilities of stories. The friendships I rekindled grew stronger, their support helping me rebuild my confidence and sense of self. One day, as I was rearranging a shelf, a customer approached me with a question about a book. I turned to find a man about my age, his smile warm and open. We chatted for a while, and when he left, he slipped a note into my hand. "Dinner sometime?" For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something new. Hope. I wasn't ready to jump into anything, but the idea that I might one day open myself up to love again no longer felt impossible. Sitting on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a quiet sense of contentment. My life was far from perfect, and the scars of my choices would always remain, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to live with my mistakes, to own them without letting them consume me. I had learned the value of honesty not just with others but with myself. And though I didn't know what the future held, I felt ready to face it, with courage, with gratitude, and with the knowledge that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones we take within ourselves, but they're also the most important. Because in the end, it's not about perfection or redemption. It's about growth, about learning, and about finding the strength to keep moving forward. And for the first time in years, I was ready to do just that.